What's the worst thing you have ever done to an annoying neighbor? I had a terrible work schedule and had to wake up at 2:30 a.m. to be at work by 4 a.m. My downstairs neighbors would blare loud music at all hours of the night, and I could feel the bass through my mattress. I went downstairs and politely asked them to turn down the music, and they seemed to kindly agree. As soon as I got back in bed, they turned it up even louder and kept it going until about 1:30 a.m. Before I left for work at 3:30, I turned over my amplifier so that the speaker was facing the floor, turned the volume up, and set my guitar on top of it. I left for my 12-hour shift, and the feedback was still screaming when I came home. Neighbors never blared their music again. We lived in a neighborhood of townhouses. One neighbor let their dogs shit all over everyone's lawn and never picked it up. We tried asking them, we tried picking it up and putting it on their doorstep, they refused to do it. My one neighbor decided to get a piece of it and smear it all over the front of the house. After that, they started picking it up. Similar story happened where I live. There was a really quiet, meek guy, and a neighbor would constantly let their dog poo on his front lawn. He tried all the normal things like pepper on the lawn, motion sprinklers, little signs, etc., etc. The dog owner didn't care and continued letting his dog poo on the man's lawn. Then one day, the man was pushed too far. The next part of the story came from a decorator I know who lives in the same close. What happened was the guy got so mad he mashed up and liquidized his own poo and made a watery enough substance that he put into a super soaker. He followed the man home and then returned in the middle of the night and emptied it through the man's letterbox. The impact splatter hit the walls, hallway, stairs and ceiling and even reached into the kitchen at the end of the hallway. Apparently the stench was horrendous. Fear the wrath of a patient man. My mom's neighbor called the city to demand they make my mom repair her fence that divided their yards. This lady has always been a crabapple for 10+ years, but this move pissed my mom off. The fence did need a few mild repairs, which my mom would have done if the neighbor had just come talk to her. She was already in the process of getting quotes. The city contacts my mom and says you have to maintain your fence. My mom asks if she legally has to have a fence, and the person she talked to could sense where this was going. Turns out there are rules about maintaining a fence, but not requiring you have one, so my mom pays a contractor to tear it down entirely. The neighbor does come to talk to my mom and asks when the new fence will be built. My mom says, "You want a fence, build it yourself." Couple weeks later my mom has a nice new fence, courtesy of one annoying neighbor. A little petty, perhaps, but hilarious nonetheless. This one's not my story, but my great-grandfather's. My great-grandfather was one of the last people in town to get indoor plumbing, and as such, had an outhouse in his backyard. Every year on Halloween, neighborhood kids would come into the yard and knock over the building and expose the cesspit. He got tired of it. So one year, the night before Halloween, he moved the building forward, then covered the fess with burlap, disguising it in leaves and grass clippings. In the dark, it was almost impossible to tell it was there. Halloween night, he sat in the outhouse and waited. It wasn't long after sundown when he heard the wet splat outside as a couple of kids fell into the muck. He lowered a ladder into the cesspit for them to leave after making them promise to never mess with his outhouse again. The kids honored their promise, and even spread the word around the neighborhood not to mess with that outhouse anymore. They assaulted my dad because he told them to stop yelling at a woman parked in the road, so I bided my time for a few weeks, then filled all the locks on their work van with superglue. If they had power locks with a remote, they won't know until it's an emergency. Haha. When I was really young, our neighbor, Drugget, demanded we move our septic tank because he claimed it was partially on his property. He was a complete jerk about it, and kept at it. My dad's a really laid-back person. Eventually even he got mad and had the property line surveyed. Turns out not only was the septic tank on our property, not his, but the corner of his house and part of his driveway was actually on our land. Dad spent the next few months asking him when he was going to move his house off our land. In our first house, my wife and I had a neighbor who disliked us from the start. Apparently the people that lived there before us were family friends who went through a divorce, and we were the ones who bought their house. They were petty and mean to my wife, who doesn't like confrontation, parking across our driveway when she about to go to work, throwing pieces of wood over the fence, letting their dog crap on our lawn and not picking it up, etc. I tried talking to them a couple times too and was promptly told to F off. The husband loved his lawn care and used to brag about how it looked to everyone, so the next time it rained, I went out back and threw an entire box of beef broth cubes into their backyard and let the rain melt them into the grass. Their dog absolutely destroyed their yard looking for the smell, and I would make sure to comment on it every chance I got. We moved shortly after. Upstairs neighbor was noisy late at night, like 2 a.m., music, loud footsteps. We had repeated conversations about it, but he blew us off, bought us earplugs, and told us to deal with it. Unfortunately for him, the breaker box for the building was in our unit. A few tests later, with his friendly roommates who hated him just as much, we zeroed in on the breaker to his room in an unoccupied area. Guess who had strange power issues at night when being disruptive? They would miraculously resolve at 7 a.m. He wasn't the brightest bulb in the box and never did suspect us. The landlord was aware of his disruptiveness, and he was already on thin ice. We let him know not to call the power C regarding his issues, and he was on board. After assaulting one of his roommates over an unrelated incident, his ass was kicked to the street at the end of the lease. Not me, but my grandpa. My grandpa's neighbor's septic tank started leaking into my grandpa's backyard. He repeatedly asked his neighbor to fix the septic tank and clean up the mess in his yard. The neighbor completely brushed him off, so my grandpa took matters into his own hands. He rigged up a plumbing system in his yard. He installed an upright PVC pipe that pointed at the neighbor's backyard over the fence. I don't know how the system worked. I was only about 8 years old, in the early 90s, but it was set up to spray the neighbor's own septic waste over the fence and into the neighbor's beautiful and polished yard. And just like that, the neighbor fixed his septic tank. They remained enemies until my grandpa died a couple of decades later. I missed that old crazy bastard. The rich brats next door were always throwing loud drunken parties when their mom and dad went out of town for a few days, which was often. One Sunday morning I went out to find the corner of our lot, which was a school bus stop, littered with used condoms that had been left in the street or thrown into the grass. That night around midnight I gloved up and collected a bunch of them, then snuck into the neighbor's yard and scattered them around the pool, the garage, and the back door, where Mom was sure to see them when she came home. There were no more parties. When I was 10 or so, an old lady yelled at my brother and I for sitting on her curb, and not just yelled, she really bitched us out. So we got the bright idea to have an estate sale for her. We got up at like 4 a.m. on Saturday morning and put up homemade cardboard garage sale signs we made with her address on them and "Early Birds Welcome" in bold letters. We then sat on the curb a little down the street across from her house and watched people bang on the door for an hour or so. The best part is we didn't put a date on the signs, so if she didn't find all the signs, presumably people would keep showing up every Saturday. Estate garage sailing here is an aggressive sport. After all of us kids moved out for college, my parents changed the basement to become a livable unit and started renting it. First 2 tenants, about 5 years, were great. Never had an issue with them. Third group of tenants stopped paying rent after 3 months. Since it was winter, we couldn't evict them, and my parents had to suffer through their parties and cigarette smell while not receiving rent that was used to pay 70% of the mortgage. My parents being retired, they needed the rent money. Almost lost their house because of these a-holes. Well, my brothers and I were home for Christmas that year, and after hearing about the issues, we decided to take care of it. Since it's my parents' house and the people stopped paying rent, we decided to move in with them. We had the keys and would come in and out of the apartment as we wanted. A friend needs a place to sleep? No worries, we have a unit downstairs with 2 beds and 2 couches. Feel free to stay as long as you want. Bars are closing and we want to keep partying? No problem, we have a furnished apartment, and we won't be bothering my parents. I would go there to shower at 2 or 3 in the morning so I don't wake my parents up. My brother slept in one of the beds for 5 days. I invited 20 people once, and we were all drinking until 5 a.m. when none of the guys had to work in the morning. They did complain about privacy. We told them that according to the law we were not allowed to throw them out at the moment, but since they stopped paying rent they lost all privilege over the house. They called the cops the first night they found my brother sleeping there. We explained the situation to the police, and said that they'd have to take us to court if they wanted us to stop using our apartment. Friend had a neighbor who put in a very bright yard light that was pointed at her bedroom window. After a negative interaction when asking neighbor to re-aim or dim the light or such, cue theater stagehands. She put up a parabolic mirror pointed directly at dude's bedroom, used an old projector dowser, and an old lighting board to program a chase sequence that was hours long and repeated. End result was a beam of randomly blinking light that was aimed at neighbor's bedroom window. When he complained, she let him know that it was his light source and all he had to do was turn off his yard light. Do you have a similar story? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.